You there, me here.
Okay.
There we go.
Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to the second program in our 2022 Landmark Lecture Series. We will begin our evening with our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their homes in the DC area today. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jessi Grieser. She's an associate professor of English linguistics in the Department of English at the University of Tennessee, and she has traveled here from Tennessee to be with us this evening, so we're particularly pleased to have you here. She received her PhD in sociolinguistics from Georgetown University, and she researches discourse approaches to the linkages between language and race and place identities, African American language, and language and gentrification, with a side discourse analysis of online speech. Her book, The Black Side of the River, Race, Language, and Belonging in Washington, D.C., was released by Georgetown University Press in 2022. So brand new book. Congratulations. Her presentation this evening will focus upon this research. So very pleased to introduce Dr. Jessi Grieser.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming this evening. And I hope this will be a lecture and a lively conversation about what DC means, as a place, and in the particular place that my work takes place, which is the Black Side of the River. Thinking about this part of DC that is east of the Second River, of where DC was originally created. And one of the things that I want to begin with as well is a brief land acknowledgement from where I'm coming from, because place is always about who occupies that place and who has historically occupied that place. And so I'm coming to you from Knoxville, Tennessee, which is the historic lands which still are unceded and belong to the Muskogee Cree people, to the Cherokee people, and to the Choctaw people, all of whom still have vibrant presences in East Tennessee that we celebrate as folks from East Tennessee. And then, of course, as was mentioned, the Piscataway Conoy people and the Nacotchtank people, because I can't talk about a neighborhood that is named for the Nacotchtank people and the anglicization of their name, the Nacostin, the Anacostia people, without talking about to whom this originally belonged. This lecture is also important in that, so here's a thing that academics very often do. We do these little siloed pieces of research, and we pop into a community and we interview them and we get our data. And especially, this is especially true of graduate students, because this work, although it has taken the past almost decade, actually a decade and a year, I started this work in 2011. Although it has seen me through several parts of my career, it began as a graduate student work, as my doctoral dissertation. And one thing that happens with doctoral dissertations is often you go in, you need a degree, you get your stuff, you get your data, you get out, and you never come back to the community. I had an opportunity a few weeks ago, actually several weeks ago, when I first launched the book in February. And I took the book to the Fort Stanton Community Center, where I had worked with several of the senior citizens in that group. And I took a copy of the book and said, I brought this, it's finally done, here it is, I want you all to have a copy. And what the proprietor of that group, he's pseudonymed Mr. Moore in the book. And what Mr. Moore had to say was, he said, people come all the time. And they ask us for our information all the time. And we participate in research all the time. And you're the first person who brought it back. And so it's opportunities like this that are important to me as a researcher, and important to me as a researcher who's interested in social justice, because it doesn't mean anything if I don't give it back and have a conversation with people from DC about what DC is about and what it means for Black DC to exist. So now I will grab the next slide. And I want to center us in. So I'll talk a little bit about what discourse analysis is and why linguistics is the way in to thinking about Washington, D.C. But at its heart, it's about the kinds of things that people have to say. And so I want to center us in on one particular quote, which I'm going to use to frame this lecture. And I will start with it, I'll end with it. And so we're sort of beginning here and traveling to it. And it comes from Justin. Justin is an IT aide. He was in his 40s at the time that I interviewed him, working at one of the local public elementary schools in Southeast DC. And he had this to say about some of the changes that were going on in the neighborhood. He said, I also think that, again, what I said, the kind of statements of things that progress makes a lot of the communities that have been allowed to just kind of deteriorate, and then you come in and you build these new mega structures, et cetera. And it says to me, these are things that could have happened a long time ago. And it could have happened in a way such that people who were here benefited from it, and they didn't have to be displaced. These are things that could have happened a long time ago, and it could have happened in a way such that people who were here benefited from it, and they didn't have to be displaced. So, east of the river, the Black side of the river. We're not east of the river at the moment. We're in Georgetown. So I'm going to pull us forward one slide and read to you from the beginning of chapter 1. There we go. Get to hear him.
A lot of the communities that have been allowed to kind of deteriorate, and then you come in and you build these new mega structures, et cetera. It says to me, these are things that could have happened a long time ago, and it could have happened in a way such that people who were here benefited from it, and they didn't have to be displaced.
All right, meditate on that one. But we're not there. We are west of the river. In fact, really importantly, we're west of the park, which is a distinction that I talk about a little bit in the book. We're in Georgetown, and Georgetown has a really important part to play in the Black history of DC. If you stood at the intersection of M Street and Wisconsin Avenue Northwest on a sunny mid-afternoon, you'd look across a bustling commercial strip. Cars driving west are headed for the Key Bridge, which takes them into the neighborhood of Rosslyn in Arlington, Virginia, or toward Foxhall Road into the very affluent neighborhood of Foxhall Palisades. To your left and right, ahead of you and behind you, you will see all manner of boutique shops, including Washington, D.C.'s first Apple store and high-end clothing shops like Abercrombie & Fitch and Calvin Klein. Shoppers with arms filled with bags duck in and out of tiny eateries, and a line 3 blocks long leads into Georgetown Cupcake, a bakery made famous by the Food Network. Up and down the street, baskets of magenta petunias hang from lampposts, decorating the city street as though it is a suburban outdoor mall. This is the neighborhood of Georgetown, the most exclusive handful of blocks in all of Washington. The shopping caters to nearby affluent residents of Foxhall, Georgetown, Palisades, and Glover Park, and the neighborhood is a frequent stop for local and national celebrities alike. Georgetown is synonymous with wealth, disposable income, and appearance. But Georgetown wasn't always this Georgetown. In the late 1960s, one African-American DC resident taking part in a linguistics study commented to his interviewer that Georgetown was one of the roughest places that, Georgetown and Foggy Bottom of Washington was one of the roughest neighborhoods that you could come out of. And most like you live by the sword, you die by the sword, or something of this nature. But you had to be strong in order to survive in those places. So what happened to take Georgetown from one of the roughest neighborhoods you could come out of to making it synonymous with white people with money to burn? In a word, gentrification. As in Anacostia, a mix of enslaved Africans and their descendants, along with freed blacks, originally populated Georgetown, which had a sizable African American population since the antebellum period. The city was considered an advantageous port, being situated on the Potomac, and it served as a gateway to shipping west toward Appalachia. By the early 1900s, the neighborhood of Georgetown was home to one of the most concentrated African American populations in the city, and is still home to many Black cultural landmarks, such as Mount Zion United Methodist Church, the first Black congregation in Washington, D.C. More than half of the older interviewees quoted in this book were born at Georgetown Hospital, and many of them spent their early childhoods in Georgetown before moving to Anacostia as teens and young adults in the 1940s and 1950s. While this moving process began early in the 20th century, the 1968 riots accelerated the relocation of a more affluent white population to Georgetown, and the African American residents who had been there were dispersed to other parts of the city, many to the southeast quadrant. Legal changes to the neighborhood accelerated this process. During the New Deal, the old Georgetown Act established Georgetown as a historic district, which caused housing prices to slowly rise. While some Black homeowners were able to benefit from the sale of their appreciated properties, others were pushed out by rising property taxes they could no longer afford. Between 1930 and 1960, the Black population of Georgetown shifted from 30% to only 9% of the total. By the time of my interviews in Southeast, which took place in 2011 to 2013 and 2016 to 2017, Georgetown was under 3% Black. This change was mirrored, albeit less drastically, across the district. In the 1970s, 7 out of 10 district residents were African American, and that population was spread throughout the 4 quadrants. Since the 1970s, however, the population of Black residents in the district has shrunk rapidly, with some quadrants becoming majority white and others experiencing an influx of residents of other ethnicities, such as the growing Hispanic, mostly Salvadorian population in the northwest quadrant of Mount Pleasant. And as white residents encountered increasingly skyrocketing housing prices in neighborhoods like Georgetown and DuPont Circle, they moved into the eastern neighborhoods of the northwest quadrant that the district's Black residents had formerly occupied, pushing those residents even further east and south. Maps which plot the locations and reported ethnicity of the 2010 census respondents show sharp divides in populations which correspond to the geographic boundaries within the city. And I'm reading from the book, but I will show you those maps in just a moment. For instance, 16th Street Northwest runs south from the peak of the DC Diamond, starting in Silver Spring, Maryland, to the north lawn of the White House. Once known as the aforementioned Gold Coast of Black DC wealth, by 2010, 16th Street had become a dividing line in the city. In 2000, 16th Street divided areas in the west with a low concentration of African Americans, less than 25%, from areas to the east with a high concentration of more than 76%. Just 10 years later, the density of African Americans in the east had begun to decrease, with many neighborhoods dropping from 76% or higher to the 51 to 75 bracket, and many even down to the 26 to 50% bracket. As the white population increased in the far western quadrants, and then in the north and slowly eastward, the district's racial makeup changed as though a fan had started to open across the district, sweeping first northward and eastward, and now heading for the south. Because Georgetown was one of the first places to experience this kind of radical shift from being a center of Black culture to being a place with virtually no Black population, it has unsurprisingly come to stand in for the process of gentrification more generally. In the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, you can see a change, says Chess, an IT coordinator for one of the elementary schools in Anacostia, who was born in DC in the mid-1950s, especially like down on 14th Street. You go down there and be like, ooh, what's going on? You know, we knew like a Mount Pleasant area, that was Spanish, and the Europeans lived in Georgetown. But we lived in Georgetown first. And then gentrification occurred then. Europeans took over Georgetown, But the early part, like say in the 50s, 40s, or 30s, African Americans used to majority live in Georgetown. Then gentrification happened and they moved them out, and Europeans took over the area. There's a whole lot going on in that quote from Chess. There's questions of who is we and who is they, ways of laying claim to the space, ways of redefining to whom Georgetown belongs, redefining to whom Washington, D.C. belongs. And so that is what my work is about, is listening to these strategies that people use to talk about specifically Southeast DC, specifically historic Anacostia, but much more broadly, these questions of what it means for DC more broadly to be experiencing the kinds of racial changes that it has been, for what it means for the entire United States and for the Black community writ large. So I'll grab our next slide. And here's where this work began. This work has its roots, for me, in a story that came out in the Washington Post in 2011. And so one of the things that's true about being an academic is that very often you start out on a project and you have an idea of what it is that you want to talk about. And as you get into it, especially if you're doing a social science research and getting into these bigger questions of interviewing people and being in their homes and talking to them, you realize that the question you were trying to ask was not the question that matters. And this is the case for this project. I started being really interested in what does middle-class Black speech sound like? We as linguists have done lots and lots and lots of work on the variety that we call African American English. It's the variety of English that is grammatically patterned, that is systematic. It's used by many, but not all and not exclusively African Americans in the United States. So I was very interested in quantitative work with that variety and what's happening in that variety. And we very often look for the people who use that variety the most, which are typically working class men. And so you'll hear that variety being spoken the most. But what does it look like if you hold a PhD from Howard, but are part of the Black community and using different aspects of this language to think about your Black identity? So that was the question that I was asking. And I came across this article in the Washington Post in July 2011 that said, gentrification is for both Black and white residents in Southeast DC. And it was looking at this question of what happens when middle-class Black residents from DC who've been displaced by this fan of change that's opening, what happens to these communities that have historically lived in Northeast, that historically lived in Georgetown, and were pushed into Southeast by changes across the city. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a wonderful place to study all of this quantitative stuff, and I'm going to interview people and I'm going to tape things, and this will be great. I did find some interesting things and some quantitative things, and I wrote a great dissertation that I turned in for my PhD at Georgetown. But what I discovered instead was that what really mattered were the ways that people were talking about their space, the ways that people were imagining Black DC, imagining Black Southeast. So now I will move to these two maps, which I read to you and talked about a little bit before. But this is the 2000, and this is actually 2000 to 2015. They're a little bit different than the ones that are printed in the book. And you can see in the circled ellipsis part, that is 16th Street Northwest, that used to be the African American Gold Coast. That was where all of DC's exorbitant Black wealth lived. And even as late as 2000, so that was 1970 that it really was for sure the Gold Coast. But even as late as 2000, you can see these extremely dense Black populations living there. That's that very dark blue. And then notice what has happened in 15 years. You can see these dark blue areas going to much lighter blue. However, at the same time, Look what's not necessarily happening in Southeast, which is this second ellipsis down at the bottom. In the areas of historic Anacostia, Congress Heights, all of these areas that are east of the river, there's some slight change. But this is a population that has remained 91, 92, 93% Black alone on the census. And I'll point out that that's also really important because the Black alone designation has changed. Before 2000, I, as a mixed race person, could only choose one box on the census. Starting in 2000, people were allowed to select more than one racial category. So when we're talking about 1970, a Black alone population, in 2000, we're actually talking about a lot of people who aren't getting counted as Black, who identify as Black, but are not part of that Black alone. So we're actually talking about still a very high density of DC's African American community. Of course, grab a slide. When you have that kind of concentration, you get all sorts of wonderfully, totally benign. This has nothing to do with racism whatsoever, right? This is just opinions about an area of town. So we get these sorts of depictions of what it means to be east of the river. So we get like this joke map from mapurbane.com, which you'll notice that we are currently situated in Metroless Popped Polo Land. I used to live up in Woodley Park, which is single ladies and pandas. Represent. And the entire area east of the Anacostia River is the zone of perceived danger. The quote here, which I will not subject you to my absolutely terrible French pronunciation, but this is the French State Department giving a travel advisory for French citizens traveling to Washington, D.C. The quarter of Anacostia is not recommended day or night. So those sorts of things are in the air. At the same time, we have Black DC. DC, which is known as Chocolate City, where we have Funkadelic Parliament in 1970, at that point when DC was 70+% African American, naming this city. You know, the song begins, one day we're gonna have the White House too. 2008, we had the White House too. We have DC's go-go scene. All of the incredible Black history that we have in DC, Frederick Douglass, Duke Ellington, Langston Hughes, all of this history of Black DC. It makes this a place where we're thinking about Black culture, makes DC a place where we can reimagine what it means to be in the United States. And this map comes from a book called Chocolate Cities Sociology by Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter. And what they're doing is they're taking a line from Malcolm X's writing. If you south of Canada, then you in the South. And they use that to rethink the entire United States as a series of different kinds of Souths, a series of different ways where the Black experience has mapped the space, not the white experience, and to rethink Black life as being the central legacy of American experience. Okay, so how do we get at this? How do we start to understand how Blackness is inscribed on a space, how people can lay claim to a space, how people can make DC a Black space? Well, I want us to think about a linguistic concept. And this is where this question of why am I not an urban anthropologist or a city planner or something like that, which are all careers that I've considered. My love of cities has been long-standing. It is part of the reason I came to DC to begin with, to do my graduate work at Georgetown. But linguistics offers us an interesting way in thinking about the ways that people organize their talk. And one of the concepts, the main concept I want to introduce you to is the idea of a big D discourse. Even if you've never heard this term before, you know about big D discourses. They're the ways that we organize thinking about a particular topic. And I'll give you a concrete example. Having babies makes you tired. No matter how you're talking about having a baby and being a parent of a newborn, you're somehow going to orient to this idea that you should be tired. You might be talking about how much sleep you're getting, or like whether or not the baby has slept early, or whether or not you can nap when the baby naps. You might be saying, oh my gosh, I am so tired, and the baby never sleeps and it's always screaming. But somehow you know that there's a thing you're supposed to be talking about if you're a new parent. That's what a big D discourse is. It's the thing you're supposed to be talking about. So one of the things we see in the way that the residents of Southeast talk about their neighborhood are these responses to these big D discourses. There's a big D discourse about gentrification, that it's just about money. You know, it's property values, and it's, well, you know, a house that used to cost $250,000 in Mount Pleasant costs $800,000 now. Then, right? This is 2015, probably 1.2 now, and more. Well, I'm going to move to Southeast because I can still get a house for $250,000. And we're going to have that big D discourse that gentrification is just about money flows, right? And of course, it's about where people can buy. I would like to offer an alternative argument. So there's a couple different ways that people defend Black community in Southeast Washington, D.C. And I'm going to leave this slide up to show you each of these three things. And then I'm going to read to you some examples from the book. So one of the first things that happens is people talk about white people in the neighborhood. Now, during the time that I was doing this research, the neighborhood actually was not particularly white. And it wasn't even particularly whitening. At the beginning of my research, I collected data in two periods, from 2011 to 2013, and then from 2015 to 2017, or really almost 2016. It was late 2015. And in those two periods, the white population east of the river increased by about 1 to 2%. And so like in historic Anacostia downtown, we're talking a couple dozen white people in the neighborhood itself. But a conversation arises about whiteness. And we see three different interpretive frames. So you see people talk about white people as a neutral situation where they're just kind of there. And that's remarkable. You see people talk about white residents as a negative force, encroaching on the neighborhood. And you see people talking about white residents as a positive force. They're actually adding to the diversity of the neighborhood. And so I'll give you some examples of each of these three. And so the first one comes from Tana. Tana, at the time I was interviewing her, was pursuing a master's degree at Trinity University. Lifelong DC resident, grew up in historic Anacostia and was living in Congress Heights at the time. And this is an example of whiteness as neutrality. You know, my brother and I were in a coffee shop on Martin Luther King Avenue. It's been more than a year ago. And there were all of these people who were coming in that were white, okay? So like I said, when we first moved there to Anacostia as children, even though it was a changing community, I never saw the white people. But we were in there, we were having coffee, and these white people are coming in. And my brother says to one of the guys, hey, what are you doing in here? Where did you come from? And so the guy said, oh, I live up the street. And so and so and so and so. And my brother said, who are all these other white people that you're talking to that are coming in here? And they belong to some kind of organization. But he said that they all live in Anacostia. So my brother was like, wow, things are really changing. He said, wow, things are really changing, sis. I said, yeah, things are changing. And so what I want to point out here is that this is not a particularly positive or negative framing. It's just, we're in this coffee shop and there are white people here. Why are you here? Well, you live here. Things are changing. And so we get this neutral framing. We also have a very negative, and for this I'm going to turn back to Chess, who talked about Georgetown being gentrification. And he said when he was a driver in the 1970s, he used to get to pick up all sorts of dignitaries and people who were visiting DC. And so he's talking about Representative Fauntleroy, who he got to drive around. And he said, I've seen Representative Fauntleroy before. And I asked him and I said, what is going on? You know, seems like a lot more Europeans are coming in and we're being moved out. He said, it's not only happening here, it's happening all over the country. You know, there's a plan that's gone into effect and you can see it. You know, you can see it happening with they're building new establishments and there's people in that you haven't seen in the community before and now in the community, you know, walking their dogs and stuff like that. And it's almost like, how did this happen? You know, it's like magical. It was a subtle fastness with it, you know. You ain't notice it, and then all of a sudden it's there. You look up and, oh man, what's going on? And I plucked that line, a subtle fastness, to actually use as my title of this section of the book, because I think it just really captures what is happening and how it feels to the people who are in the neighborhood, who are reading through this negative frame where this is takeover. But it's this takeover that is simultaneously happening in a way that people aren't seeing it and incredibly quickly. And then another example is whiteness is positive. And in this frame, you get an idea of, well, this neighborhood has historically been African-American since the very beginning. And instead, now we're seeing white people and, you know, they're part of the diversity of the neighborhood. And so Dolores, who was a woman in her 60s, retired, said, as you come up on the left-hand side, it's some houses there that is being remodeled, and they occupied by white people. You know, that's a good thing. All us supposed to live together. But this, I've never known a white person to live on Hill Street. Never. So when I walked down the street, I introduced myself and I spoke with them and everything. Seemed to be nice people. They said they enjoy the neighborhood. I tell them good. So we have different ways of framing whiteness, of framing who's coming in, and getting to control the narrative about who's coming in and what that means. We also see deixis. And you had a chance to hear this a little bit in the original quote from Chess about Georgetown. Deixis really simply is pointing. So a deictic word is one that we can't understand without understanding the physicality of a place. So if I say over there, you don't understand what over there means unless you know where I am positioned. There is a deictic. That's all that this is. Deixis is also pronouns. So when we say us, when we say them, the only way that we can reference that is by knowing who belongs in the us and where the us is positioned. So one thing that we see often is residents using these pronouns to decide who gets to be us and who gets to be them. In that quote from Chess earlier, we heard about them moving into DC, moving us into Southeast. And then I had a very explicit quote from one of my interviewees, Gus, who said, you know, it's going to become bad for us. And then he stopped and he looked at me and he went, us, meaning Black folk. And so through these usage of they and them and us, the we gets stretched out from not just the we who are co-present sitting at a table in an interview, or the we who are part of the neighborhood, but the we who are Black DC, Black Americans, and claiming the space for everyone who belongs in that group. And then one of the last strategies that we see are these very subtle countering of the discourses about Southeast. So you might remember that map that I showed you of the zone of perceived danger. Don't go to Anacostia day or night. These ways that people are talking about the community, it's crime-ridden, it's dirty. We could talk all day and all night about the racist roots of those sorts of ideas. But one of the things that happens when you talk to people who are from the neighborhood, you don't ask for these stories. I didn't go around saying, did you know that people think that the neighborhood is crime-ridden, and what do you think about that? That was never a question I asked. But I would get things volunteered. Things like this, which is also from Tana, who I quoted earlier with her brother at the coffee shop, talking about growing up in Berry Farm and visiting Berry Farm, the government housing project that is east of the river, that has now recently been demolished and is slated to be replaced. We could talk about that in the Q&A. One of the places that outsiders might most consider, oh, this is drugs, this is crime, this is everything bad. And what she had to say is, it was almost idyllic. We had great friends. Our parents had friends, and we played without being bothered by people. So it was great. People looked out for you. It was great. And so was that neighborhood pool that was there. It was a neighborhood pool. It's still there. It's in Berry Farms. So it's in what some people would consider one of the worst neighborhoods in the city, but it was the newest pool in the area. So we would walk around there to the swimming pool. No one would bother us. We would get in the pool, swim all afternoon, and get out. And what you see in this quote, and many others like it, is a rejection of all of these negative ideas that everyone else has. I'm going to cut you off at the pass. It's what my interviewees are essentially doing. I'm going to tell you how beautiful it is here before we have a chance to even think about it not being beautiful. I'm going to tell you about how safe it is here before we even get into what the crime rate might be. I'm going to tell you how people look out for each other. I'm going to talk about the way that we are in community together before we even get started on anything else. These subtle ways of reflecting back a very different perspective on Southeast DC. So I told you I was going to use Justin to frame this talk. So let's go back to that quote that we started with. And I think actually if you hit forward, we'll hear it again.
Again, the kind of statements and things that progress makes. A lot of the communities that have been allowed to kind of deteriorate, come in and build these new mega structures, et cetera. It says to me, these would have happened a long time ago, and it in a way such that people who were here benefited from it. Didn't have to be displaced.
Okay, and I'll reread it for the sake of the folks who are coming with us on Zoom. That I also think, again, what I said, the kinds of statements of things that progress makes. A lot of the communities that have been allowed to just kind of deteriorate, and then you come in and you build these new mega structures, et cetera. You come in, you build these new mega structures, et cetera. And it says to me, these are things that could have happened a long time ago, and it could have happened in a way such that people who were here benefited from it, and they didn't have to be displaced. What we see in all of these subtle moves that people make in the way that they talk about white residents moving in the way that they talk about who's us, who's them, who's you, who's me, the ways that we talk about beauty instead of filth, safety instead of crime, and anticipating all of these stories that are being told about the community actually serve a larger purpose. I mentioned before that big D discourse about gentrification, that it's just about money. People who have it, the playing field's level. If you want to move someplace that's cheaper, you're just going to move someplace that's cheaper. What that does, that whole narrative, obscures the role of race. And one of the things, the main thing that is happening in all of these ways of talking about Southeast more generally and DC more broadly, is it re-racializes the act of gentrification, claims it back, and says, no, DC has always been home to affluent Black residents. It repositions the city as outsiders who are letting the neighborhoods deteriorate, who could have acted earlier but did not. And it changes the way that we think about the community, changes the discourses about east of the river into affluence, into beauty, into safety, into community. Basically taking this narrative about gentrification and saying, nah, no thanks. This is about Black place, and we're going to be Black people who protect it. So I will leave us there. And I have contact info on the next slide, and I would love to entertain all of your questions.
So just to sort of piggyback, this is my aunt and my mom, and we're all from Alexandria, but I live in Prince George's County right now, and your presentation was incredibly intriguing. I actually want you to start research again to see what kind of data you will get from today, because the map that you showed, it's quite interesting because Southeast is really changing as well. And even Prince George's County, where I live right over the line. I live in District Heights, and
Ward 9.
Yes, Ward 9, what they call it. And I'm getting a lot of white neighbors in my neighborhood. But my question for you is, what do you envision? Because this is not just happening in Washington, D.C. It's happening in cities all over, like you mentioned. I think of Jackson Ward in Richmond, Philadelphia, Harlem, these cities that have rich Black history. And, you know, once upon a time, gentrification was seen as sort of like a good thing, as you described in your presentation, because it does provide opportunity where we revitalize these neighborhoods. The problem is it does push out those folks that have been there, again, that rich history. And the issue that I'm having in a lot of the cities that I mentioned is that these cities are being run by Black folks. And so the question of, is this a benefit is this racial? Or is this about, you know, corporate money, because it's being run by Black folk, and certainly they're saying in the Black community, all skin folk ain't kin folk. But what do you envision? I would say, because these things are changing daily. The demographics in cities all over this country are changing daily. So what do you envision for Washington and other cities like New York and Philadelphia? San Francisco, you know, with the rich history in San Francisco, it's just, I have a friend that lives on 13th and Taylor, in Northwest, and that was her parents' home that she currently lives in. Her parents have passed away, and she now lives in that house. But they totally, you know, gentrified that area. And when she's out walking her dog, she's had, you know, young white neighbors come to her and say, "Oh, you live around here? What are you doing around here?" And she's like, "I've been here for 60 years, you know." But yeah, so to put a period at that, what do you envision in DC and a lot of these cities across the country? I would say in the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the intervention that I hope to be making with my work, because I think a lot of these conversations and a lot of these positionings are subtler than most people realize. And the kinds of things that people are saying about their communities are not as obvious that they are about race, are not as obvious that it's pushing back, sometimes not even to the speakers themselves, right? And the people who are engaging in them, and they realize like, oh, I feel the need to talk about it this way, but I couldn't tell you why. Couldn't tell you exactly what it is that that has happened. And it's gathering up all of these stories into one place and being able to organize them and think about, okay, here are the actual things that we're hearing, because it's true. So I draw some of my work draws pretty heavily on scholar Mary Patillo, who is up at Northwestern, and she's been studying the coast of Lake Michigan in Chicago, which has historically been a Black-run, Black-owned, Black neighborhood, and also big housing projects. Really, really has a lot of similarities with Southeast DC in terms of who's been there. And then, of course, Chicago being another one of these cities that has a long history of being predominantly Black, having Black people run it, all of these sorts of things. And one of the things that she saw was that people, including middle and upper class African Americans, hear the narrative about the money, hear the discourse of the money, and also speak the discourse of the money. And also buy into these ideas. And so what I hope to do is to be sort of uncovering the different layers that are there and saying, okay, here's how to listen to people so that we don't get everyone caught up in the same narrative that it's just about money, that we're just operating on this big D discourse and ignoring all of the racial aspects, especially in places where Black culture has been so important and so vital. And so my book ends talking about the word bastion, which is just not a word you hear all that often. And so this is the kind of thing that makes a linguist's ears prick up and you go, well, wait a minute, I'm hearing this word from more than one person. This is not just a specialty. I had multiple interviewees who said, you have to understand that Southeast is the last bastion, that it's the fortress of Black culture. And so what I hope to be doing is identifying these fortresses and saying, okay, how do we use this information to work with people in a community, to listen to people in a community in ways that, like that quote from Justin, that these things could have been done all along. And there are opportunities. So one of the Southeast DC being the bastion, it has not quite has what happened on 14th and U happened in Southeast DC. Funny story about that. I was wearing my Anacostia Community Museum t-shirt working on a habitat house in Knoxville, Tennessee. And somebody said, oh, the Anacostia Community Museum, are you from DC? I said, yeah, I lived there for 7 years, love it, really wish I was there, but, go where the job is. I tell all my friends I live in DC, I'm just away on business for the next 30 years. And he said, there's one corner in DC that, that corner has changed more than any place in DC. When you think about, it was just this, I just cut him off and I said, 14th and U. And he's like, yeah, 14th and U. There's an opportunity to make sure that Martin Luther King and Good Hope is not Orange Theory and Lululemon 10 years from now. There's an opportunity to make sure it may. There's an opportunity to intervene now. And so I'm calling for that intervention.
So I'm just going to take one question from our virtual audience. So that question is, did you do any work on how the new gentrifiers, white people, EOR, talked about themselves, or any thoughts on what that kind of work would look like if someone did similar work on the quote unquote newcomers?
So here's really fun fact of academic publishing period, actually, I should say. I used to work for a book publisher, so I know exactly how this goes. So actually, people sometimes ask if I had anything to do with this absolutely gorgeous cover that Georgetown University Press put on this title. Nothing whatsoever. Authors get zero control over your cover. You just pray. And they did a fantastic job. And I knew that, having worked in publishing. And I said, I think I would like to see this on the cover and that on the cover. Irony was, I said I wanted to have the Frederick Douglass Bridge on the cover, and they went, no, we want something more lively than that. And then we ended up putting the Frederick Douglass Bridge on the cover, which was delightful. But I was thinking we'd put like the old one and the new one and have this whole metaphor of bridges, rivers. That is not what came out, but I'm really happy with it. As someone who used to work in publishing, I know that this also happens. You write a thing and you put it out there and people read it and they go, actually, this entire section of the book needs to go because it's taking away from things. The first draft of this book actually had an entire chapter that was an interview with, they were not white gentrifiers. She was Asian American and her husband was a Nigerian immigrant. So, part of the Black culture, but in a very different way. Right? Raced as Black, but not part of African American culture, because he came here as an adult. And they had moved from Brightwood. They had moved from Brightwood and had come to Anacostia, and they had bought their house and they painted it and put up a fence. But they were very aware of the kinds of signals that they were doing with that. And they said, we thought really hard before we painted our house because we knew that was going to make it really clear who we were. The really interesting thing, and the reason why I got told to cut it, and I said, well, all right, I'll leave this for the second book and the further research. Right? In an ideal world, had there not been a pandemic, I would have started another round of interviews right as the pandemic started. So right around 2019, 2020, and get another chunk. So that's forthcoming. But the really interesting thing was that they were saying a lot of the same things. And so that was part of the reason why the reviewers for the books, this is kind of repetitive. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's the point. That's the really interesting thing, is that this first wave of people are saying all the same things, being somewhat cautious about how they inhabit the neighborhood, saying, all right, we're the people who moved in. Yeah, there are boys who come and like buy food at the gas station, corner store, and then they've finished their chips by the time they reach our house, and they just shove their chip bag in our bushes. And she's like, but I'm not going to go out and yell at them because it's their bush, not really ours. And so she's like, I'm aware of what my presence means in this neighborhood in a particular kind of way. So that was the one interview I did with that population, but that's the next step, is to really start talking to folks. I'm also exceedingly intrigued and disappointed in the city, but in this redrawing of the ward maps that has put Navy Yard, Ballpark, and all of that area of DC, particularly since it's sort of politically different than the rest of DC, which is interesting, and circled that into Ward 8. And, and that is a couple months old. So seeing what that does, and, what that does to the discourse, because now you can't say, there's a Whole Foods in Ward 8. Nobody east of the river can get to it very easily, but there is a Whole Foods in Ward 8, right? There are economic drivers in Ward 8. They're on the wrong side of the river, but they're there now. So I'm very interested in that development.
Oh, yeah. When you were showing the first slide and you were talking about intervention, and I guess my question is, when and how will these interventions and these really hard conversations take place? And using your book as a guide, the language or the linguistics to have those interventions and to have those hard conversations. Typically, they occur after or, during the wave of gentrification.
Right.
And Does it take political clout? It takes energy from the community that's being dispersed?
Both of those, for sure. It takes political clout. It takes that. It takes the community coming together. It takes the community seeing that these conversations are happening. One of the things that's been the only benefit of the pandemic for my work has been that I've been able to sit in on conversations about what east of the river should be called. And so there was a community that was kind of wanting to rename it River East. The really interesting thing is when I gave my first DC book talk, right as the book was being released a few days after it came out, I got a chance to have as my conversation partner Troy Prestwood, who is president of the Ward 8 Democrats. And he was one of the big drivers behind River East as a name. And there were all of these conversations and meetings that were happening. Well, I live in Knoxville, Tennessee now. Kind of have to be at the university you're a professor at. And so I can only get back here so often. And I was like, I really want to be in the room and just hear these conversations happening. Well, the pandemic shifted all of them to Zoom. And so I was actually able to attend many of those conversations. The way that this shook out was people kind of said, no, like we're invested in east of the river. That is what we've called it. That's what our parents called it. That's what our grandparents called it. And we're not rebranding. Thank you very much. There will be no NOMA east of the river, which is another. Very often I give some other talks about this. I have a slide that shows the NOMA water tower, and I'm like, yeah, this is one of the other things that that happens. Those are the rooms. I'm a big Hamilton fan. Those are the rooms where it happens. And so being in the rooms and giving the tools they need to hear what's being said in the rooms and not just at a surface level is where the intervention is. Several of the people that I interviewed for this book, so I tried to get a pretty good balance between everyday people. So one of the things that happens as a researcher is you often go into a community and you have to go in through the highest channels, like the most obvious visible people who are often people who are running community organizations. I wound up doing a lot of work in a really delightful way with the community of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. I think because the priest there saw that I went to Georgetown and was one of the only people who called me back and said, oh, a good Catholic school. She's gonna come interview our good Catholics. It's a wonderful community to get to know. The very first Black Catholic church in Washington, D.C. And to hear the story of how that church was founded. Dolores, who I quoted, is one of the members of the church. And so you start with those sorts of conversations. And I try to have a really good mix in overall, as I got to know more and more people, the people who are just everyday people. People I met at the library, people I met on Facebook and then said, can I interview you the next time I'm in town? Because I noticed that you're here posting. And then the people who are in positions of power. So Troy Prestwood actually is one of the people in the book who's interviewed. I interviewed people at building bridges across the river and several of the organizations there, several of the ANC commissioners as well. And so ways of having these conversations in the places they need to be had.
Any other questions? One more from our virtual audience.
Super. Hello, virtual audience. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's from Amy. Have you looked at the efforts around the proposed bridge park by the 11th Street Bridge to lessen the impact of the gentrification that the park will most certainly bring? What do you think?
I haven't looked at where the proposals sit now because the last time I was in that conversation was several years ago. I will say, I'm just going to call out that I had like the most beautiful poetic circle of this research, which was that when I first started it, the 11th Street Bridge was out. That was when it was deep in construction. It was just being finished. And I have a section, I also write fiction. And so some parts of this book were really fun to just kind of write some very fiction-y things. And I'm like, there's this harrowing drive to get off at Howard Street Southeast because the 11th Street Bridge was out. That was the beginning of my research. 11th Street Bridge gets built, blah, blah, blah. I gave the manuscript back to the publisher, the final version with the page proofs checked, the day that they put the last arch piece into the Frederick Douglass Bridge. So the East Side Bridge and the West Side Bridge, that was the entire scope of this project. Had a chance to interview as part of this project one of the directors of the Bridge Park project, in fact. And so, like I said, I've not had a chance to look at those proposals. I will say that that's where that conversation, like that's what I mean by the intervention spot. It is this moment that you realize you're doing something that's going to intend to benefit, but you have to think about all of the negative externalities, right? And so I talk about, and there's a line in the book where I say, bridges connect people. And so, yes, they connect people and allow people to cross from east to west, but they also allow people to cross from west to east. And so who's going to cross the Bridge Park? And so thinking about, okay, how do we put in different kinds of zoning around the housing on the two sides of that project so that the people who've always lived there can stay there? One of the things I've had a conversation with many of the seniors that I interviewed. If you're a senior, you're on a fixed income. You bought your house in 1970, right? It wasn't, you worked hard for it, you paid it off many years ago, but now it's worth $1.2 million and you're being taxed on $1.2 million, right? That those are conversations that can be had where we think about, okay, as we're building, we need to be thinking about what that's going to do to the property values. We need to be thinking about how we're going to make sure that those things don't happen in the way that they might if just left unchecked. If we just buy into this narrative of, it's just economic flows, right? Instead of thinking about who does this belong to? Who gets displaced? Who gets to stay? How do we allow people to stay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Grieser, Jessi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you all of you for joining us here this evening. And those of you who have joined us virtually, it's great to have you here. When we were thinking about this lecture series this year, we had the theme of senses of place, human connection through time and space. And you really fit the bill.
There we go.
And helping us understand how language can frame and influence our sense of place and how people see themselves. And I particularly want to thank you for including Georgetown as part of this discussion, because I think it's essential for us here at Tudor Place to understand all of that. So,
there is no Black DC without Georgetown. And so it is a deeply part of the story. So it's a joy to be here and talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. I also want to extend thanks to our team who works on the lecture series, our curator, Rob DeHart, who's the sound man and technical person, our director of education and visitor services, Stacy Queen, who greeted you at the door, and the person who has been working behind the scenes, Katie McCarthy, our education coordinator. I'm sure she's watching online, so thank you so much, Katie. I want to invite you to come to more of our lectures. There is a brochure at the rack by the door about our lecture series. The next one is coming up on March 17th. Dr. Alan Kraut from American University will discuss Irish immigrants and the role they played in the economic and social development of our nation. And so again, there's more information. We have 6 lectures. This is the second one. So we have 4 more coming up, 1 in May and then 3 in the fall. So hope you'll join us again. Thank you all for joining us again.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jessi.